So today, let's talk about interviewing and more specifically, negotiating pay during interviews. Now, negotiating pay is one of those things where it gives people a lot of concern. People are very nervous about negotiating pay. It's one of those things we're just not taught to do. We are told to sit down, shut up, and accept the damn pay that we're supposed to get. And for the most part, that's kind of how corporations are being run right now. And especially right now with the concern of not being able to find a job, the last thing we want to do is for somebody to say, yeah, we would have hired you, but you wanted 50 cents more an hour, so we just couldn't do that. So, okay, just to start about interviewing, interviewers, no matter who you're talking to, your situation is always going to be different. No two interviewers are going to be exactly the same. Now, some will attempt to be the same. Some will attempt to have standards and have rules for interviewing, and you must do these sorts of things. And then there's some of us where we more freestyle it because, like in my case, I want to know who the person is, not whether they can answer the interview questions well or not. But more often than not, especially when you're dealing with HR people and that sort of thing, they are all about procedures. They're all about standards, that sort of thing. They want no subjectivity. All they have are standards, and they stick to them, and that's very common. And it's actually one of the reasons why things have kind of gone to hell a little bit in our country, but that's for another story. And so when it comes to negotiating pay, the first thing you have to understand is that every situation is different. You have to have a little bit of awareness and understanding what your situation is. The place that you're interviewing with, the person that you're interviewing with, may not be able to negotiate pay with you. And so that's the first thing you have to understand. Just to get this out of the way, they're very commonly a thing, phone screens. If you ever get a phone screen, these people are it's usually contracted out. These people are just talking to you and finding out whether you even have any of the basic qualifications. So just to get it out of the way, you're not negotiating pay with phone screeners. The next thing that we have to do when we're even going to consider if we're going to negotiate a pay is we have to decide, is the type of position that I'm applying for, that I'm interviewing with, is this a type of company, type of position that I could negotiate the pay with? For example, if you are going to go work at a lemonade stand and you have a little boy who runs a lemonade stand and he says, well, I'll pay you $1 an hour to run the lemonade stand, you're probably not going to be able to negotiate pay that much. I realize that we like the idea that we can negotiate pay that say, well, I got $10 an hour instead of $9 an hour. At least that's the way it was when I was in college. But in reality, you're not really doing yourself a lot of good when you're negotiating your pay in that sort of situation. In those situations, you're more likely to lose a job for wanting more pay. So one of the first things that we have to do is we have to figure out whether the company that we're interviewing with will negotiate pay or not. And so if the position has an annual review, meaning on a yearly basis, they're going to review your work and they're going to give you a pay raise and that sort of thing. If that's a thing with the position that you're interviewing for, there's a good chance you can probably negotiate the pay. Now, another component is entry level. If this is an entry level position, meaning they do have an annual review, but it's an entry level position, in those sorts of situations, generally speaking, you're probably not going to be able to negotiate pay. Now, there are some situations where your position is so needed that you'll have recruiters calling you, right? So you'll have recruiters calling you and they'll say, hey, what's the rate that you would want to have this job that is a software development job with 5 years of experience? What rate would you need? And you go, I don't know, like $80 an hour, and that sort of thing. If you're in that sort of situation with contractors, you can negotiate your pay with contractors, but it still may end up losing you the job. But again, that's not quite really what we're talking about here now, is it? And so here we go. We finally decided that this type of position, it's a job that has an annual review. It's a position that is not entry level, and it's not a contract. It's actually a full-time position, and you want to negotiate pay. You would definitely be in a situation to where you could do that. So, to get started, just to break it down, there are 3 different levels of interview. Okay, during an interview, there's 3 different phases, all right? So there's the breaking ice stage, there's the deep dive stage, and there's closing discussion and questions, okay? These are the 3 parts of an interview, generally speaking. And during a first interview, the only opportunity that you're really going to have to discuss pay is going to be in the closing discussion and questions. And usually in that sort of situation, it's going to be more of a, hey, I saw that this type of position online pays $80,000 to $90,000 a year, and that's good for me. Is that something that you're expecting for this position? And those are the sorts of questions that you would ask in that first interview. Now, very commonly in positions that you could actually negotiate pay, they'll actually have multiple interviews, maybe 2 or 3, not counting the initial phone screen. But there are different types of interviews. And so the first interview is always the screening interview, where they find out whether you're any good or not. The second one is the comparison, where they have 10 people and they need to figure out which 5 of the 10 they think are best. All the interviews, third and beyond, are test stress interviews, where they find out whether you could take it, whether your longevity is going to be good, whether your mental acuity is good, that you can hang in there for long periods of time. Now, it is my opinion that interviews should never go beyond 3. You should never have to do more than 3 interviews. I know a lot of places will break that. Personally, I don't believe in that. If you can't tell from the first interview, you got problems as an interviewer. Here's the thing. You have to find out in that first interview or after the first interview whether the pay range is going to be acceptable. First, acceptable, not negotiated, but acceptable for you or not. Because if you go into that first interview and you're thinking, well, I really want to get paid $100,000, but the pay range is 70 to 80, well, why are you wasting your damn time? Now, hopefully you would know this prior to the first interview, but at the same time, it's amazing how many people actually don't know what the job offers when they get into the first interview. And so the last thing you should really be doing is taking all the time to go through the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth interview, only to find out that they don't pay enough. So always make sure you know what the pay is going into the first or after the first interview. All right, so you've gone through the first interview and you have an idea of what the pay range is and you're okay with it. This is where, once you've already established the rapport of compensation with the hiring manager, at this time, you could think about negotiating pay. And negotiating pay is kind of interesting because it would happen in the second interview. It would happen during the comparison interview where they're trying to compare you to the next guy. And if there are 10 people that they're comparing, they're going to try to figure out what are the pros and cons of each person. Now, the funny thing is, you might be saying, well, all you have to do is just shoot low and be the low guy. And so if you say it's 80 to 90, say, I'll do it for 75. That'll work every time. Yes, it might in some places, but I'm going to tell you a story. I have actually worked with hiring managers who will not hire you if you don't want money. Believe it or not. Now, there's usually not HR people. These are usually director level people or hiring managers. I had one lady that said, I won't, if they don't want the top end of the pay, I'm not even going to consider them. Now, this falls into the, man, that really muckies up the water now, doesn't it, territory. Because we like to think that we have at least some rule of thumb that if we are the low man that we're going to get the job. But there are situations to where you could be disqualified. You could be thrown out of the interview process simply because you didn't want to make money. Again, this comes down to awareness of your situation. If you're applying for some massive corporation and you're talking to some kid HR person, it's their first day on the job, you're not probably going to be able to negotiate. If you're talking to a true decision maker, true meaning a CEO, a director, somebody who their life is on the line, someone who they are responsible for their department to run properly, then and only then would you be able to really negotiate. And so that first interview question, when you talk about the pay range, does a couple of things. If you say something along the lines of, yeah, online I saw that positions like this typically pay 80 to 90, and, that pay range is okay with me. And the employer says, well, we only pay 75. And you're saying, okay, I can walk away, but If they don't, if they say, yeah, that works for us, then you already know 80 to 90 is the range. And so this is what you need to do. In that first interview, you ask that innocent question. Hey, I saw jobs like this online making between $80,000 and $120,000 a year. I'm good with that pay range. Is this comparable to what you guys are offering? And if it's higher, what you always want to do is make sure you push that pay range higher. Because ultimately, when you push that pay range higher, it sets in their mind that, man, things are changing and we really need to consider our pay. Because if we don't start paying good people, we're only going to end up with crap people. And even if we end up with good people, they're going to leave for some other company. So you need to set it in their minds that, maybe they need to change the pay rate a little bit. Maybe it's time. So even if they are only offering 80, if you walk in and say, hey, it's paid between 80 and 120, they might, in this case, be willing to go up to 90 or 100. So in that second interview, in the comparison interview, this is where you want to stand out the most. The second interview is really, really the one that matters, because this is where they're comparing you against other people. So this is where you want to be very clear about what your background is, how you would contribute, how you would help them, what your expectations are as an employee, and how much you want to get compensated. Because if they don't know the answers by the end of that second interview, you're gone. And so always, when you're negotiating pay, they need to know, first of all, what your value is. What kind of values you're bringing onto the team. Whether you have more experience than somebody, you have to imagine that there are 9 other candidates and that you are all very similar in your background. So, if you're saying, okay, well, we've got 10 accountants and all 10 accountants have 5 years of experience. They all have a CPA. What sets you apart from the next guy? Just remember that you get hired based off of how much you're liked, not necessarily what's your background, not necessarily on merit. And so you start with the merit discussion of, oh, I've been an accountant for 10 years. I have a CPA. I've been in public accounting. I know how to do reconciliations. I know how to do this. You go through all those different things, even though they can't ask the questions. You can choose to be more personal. You can bring anything to the table that's going to be potentially different than somebody else. You could say something like, well, I have an article in the Science Journal about accounting, or I wrote a book on accounting, or you could say, I have this website and blog dedicated to accounting. It just brings something to the table that's unique, that's different, but pertains to the industry. You say, I'm chairperson of this accounting group in this city. Bring something. They may not ever ask, but they may not ever know to ask. And so the second interview is when you must show your value. You must show what you are bringing to the table. The first interview was all about the merit and the background. The second interview is all about you and your contributions. So in the third phase of the second interview, remember there are 3 phases of the interview: the icebreaker, the deep dive, the closing questions, right? This is where you start asking the question. Based off my experience, this is the compensation I'm looking for. And you set that number firm. You say, this is the number I need for what I'm doing. I'm bringing you this. I have this experience. This is what I want. But then it really comes down to, is the employer looking for somebody good or somebody cheap? That's it for today. I'm SB Graham. This is Jobferno. And as always, choose skills over money.